Poor boy saves millionaire and 142 lives by piloting a plane and gets a gift from the president. The water in the bucket was ice cold, but it was the only thing flowing from the tap for weeks. Matthew plunged his face into it and tried to wake up. 13 years old, and life already felt like the weight of an airplane on his shoulders. While the town was still asleep, he swept the floor of their small, peeling walled house. Marinalva, his mother, had been washing clothes since 4 in the morning. Her hands no longer felt cold or the sting of soap, only exhaustion. On the table sat a crumpled envelope. Inside were 2 plane tickets, round trip to Salvador. It was all she'd managed to save in 6 years. Most people thought it crazy. Poor folks don't fly, they said. They should be grateful for an empty bus. But Marinalva didn't care, because this wasn't just any gift. It was her son's greatest dream, to see the sky from inside, not just from the rooftop. On the way to the airport, they rode 3 buses. They heard lowbrow jokes. A security guard asked to make sure they were in the right place. The woman at the check-in desk spoke so loudly as if they didn't understand Portuguese, but nothing dimmed Matthew's bright eyes. Every step toward the terminal felt like crossing an invisible border where everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going, except him. While others stared at their phones, he stared at the ceiling, the floor, the windows, the planes, as if he were absorbing everything, as if it were a temple. At boarding, the contrast was striking. Crisp shirts, designer backpacks, expensive luggage. And there among them, a boy in worn-out sneakers, faded jeans, eyes shining. When he sat in seat 17A over the wing, his whole body trembled, not from fear but from pure awe. Almost no one looked out the window, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the turbine. And that's when he saw it. A side panel, a kind of inspection cover, looked loose, as if it hadn't been fitted properly, small but noticeable. Matthew furrowed his brow. That wasn't right. He turned to the man next to him, a guy in a sharp suit with an expensive watch. He tried to explain, speaking low and polite, pointing outside. The man glanced over, then replied with a crooked smile. "You what? You some kind of YouTube mechanic?" He chuckled to himself, adjusted his headphones, and went back to his phone. Matthew recoiled, not knowing what to do. Leandro Albuquerque, his badge read, owner of an air cargo logistics company, used to bossing people around and ignoring them. Matthew swallowed hard. He thought about calling a flight attendant, but the doors were already closing. His mother squeezed his hand and smiled, clueless. He took a deep breath, tried to convince himself it was just paranoia. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe it was normal. But deep down, something pressed on his chest. A strange silence, as if the plane had a secret and only he had noticed it. Flight 218 took off, and with it went the uneasy feeling that wouldn't go away. 30 minutes after takeoff, the sky looked calm, blue, clear, with clouds scattered like cotton blown by the wind. Matthew still couldn't take his eyes off the left wing. That poorly fitted inspection cover was still there. Maybe it was just cosmetic, maybe not. He tried to relax. He glanced at the controls on the screen of the seat in front of him. He recognized the layouts, remembered simulators, videos, old manuals he'd read cover to cover. But knowing too much can sometimes feel like a curse. Suddenly he heard it, a sharp, metallic bang, like something had snapped inside the sky. The plane jolted, hard. A vibration shook the cabin. The left engine belched smoke. A burst of flame flickered for anyone looking out the window. Screams, panic, oxygen masks dropped like ghosts. The floor shook. A baby cried loudly. A woman turned green. A man started praying aloud. Matthew froze. What he'd feared was happening. He looked at his mother. Marinalva was trying to stay calm, but her hand was shaking. The PA cut out, then came back on. The flight attendant's voice announced they were in severe turbulence, but this wasn't turbulence, it was a malfunction. One of the engines was compromised, and from the vibration he knew they wouldn't stay in the air much longer. In the cockpit, the pilots were struggling to control things, but they didn't know what had caused the failure. One of them was injured. A crackling radio hinted at garbled distress calls. The information wasn't matching up. Communications were failing, and the tension was rising like smoke in a sealed room. Matthew looked around. Passengers were caught between fear and ignorance. Nobody there understood, but he did. He understood too much. His heart pounded. His mind told him to stay quiet, but something stronger spoke louder. If he didn't do something, the plane could crash. He rose from his seat and stumbled down the aisle. He tried to talk to the flight attendant. She told him to sit down, said it was dangerous to stand. He insisted, "I need to get into the cockpit. I know what's happening." She almost laughed, calling him just a kid. That's when a firm voice came from behind. "Listen to what he's saying." It was Marinalva, standing, eyes brimming with tears, but with the posture of someone done being ignored. "My son has spent his whole life studying airplanes, studying with whatever he had. When everyone said he was wasting his time, he was learning. If nobody does anything, we're all going to die." Silence. The flight attendant hesitated. Matthew, sweating, stared at the closed cockpit door. It was there, in that narrow aisle between coach and the door to hope, that a poor boy was taken seriously for the first time. The door opened. The cockpit reeked of sweat, burnt rubber, and urgency. The captain lay unconscious, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. The first officer, pale, was fumbling with the controls, hands shaking. Matthew stepped in, small, awkward, with the slight frame of someone who'd never known luxury, but with the sharp gaze of someone who knew exactly where he was. The flight attendant announced, "This is the boy." The co-pilot turned, taking 2 seconds to realize this was serious. Matthew didn't ask for permission. He scanned the instruments, altitude, speed, torque, RPM. He zeroed in on the critical data and with calm confidence began to speak. "Left engine is a complete failure, asymmetric torque. We're losing lift. At this flap setting, we'll stall." The co-pilot didn't reply. He simply took his hand off the yoke, stunned. Matthew sat down. His fingers didn't shake. He adjusted the trim, corrected the bank, manually shut down the left engine to prevent further damage. The shuddering eased slightly. Outside, the sky remained indifferent. Inside, an unbelieving hush. In the cabin, the crew exchanged looks, speechless. Through the cockpit window, they glimpsed the unthinkable. A 13-year-old flying an Airbus. That's when Leandro appeared. His suit wrinkled, face sweaty, eyes wide. He strode in ready to take charge, but halted mid-sentence. He saw Matthew and saw the stabilized readings. Silence. The businessman glanced at the instruments, then at the co-pilot, and finally at the boy. What are you doing?" he stammered. Matthew didn't look at him. He only answered, "Trying to keep everyone alive." Leandro took a step back, speechless. For the first time, he didn't have control. A rapid flash like a memory invading his mind. Matthew at the community center, using broken headphones to pilot an outdated simulator. Correcting the landing gear with a freezing mouse. He'd written it all down in tattered notebooks wrapped in old newspapers. Studied the controls in English, translating letter by letter. That's where he'd practiced. That's where he learned to fly. Back in the real cockpit, the co-pilot drew a deep breath. "What do you suggest, kid?" Matthew answered like a veteran. "Plot an alternate route. Check remaining fuel. See if there's a runway nearby. We'll need external help. But first, stabilize." The co-pilot nodded. Leandro left without another word. But inside him, something was shifting. The belief that power came with money was wavering. Outside, the plane limped on, wounded but airborne, and inside, the thing keeping it flying, was a boy nobody wanted to listen to. The vibration stopped, but the calm was an illusion. The plane was unstable, flying on a single engine, and the forecast was worsening by the minute. On the radar, a storm wall was building on the horizon. Lightning, severe turbulence, and no flight plan accounted for this. In the cockpit, it was critical. Fuel was on the edge. Range had plummeted since the failure. They had to choose, keep risking it, or make an emergency landing. The co-pilot suggested looking for an open field. But Matthew knew what that meant. Without a proper runway, the odds of flipping were huge, and then nobody would survive. He thought of one spot, a little used rural strip, small but just enough, a tricky landing but doable. And it was on private land about 50 miles away, the property of Leandro Albuquerque. The businessman hesitated when he heard that. That strip doesn't handle anything bigger than a single-engine plane, especially in this weather. Matthew cut in. He'd already done the math in his head. If we fly low over the lake about 10 miles from the strip, we can use ground effect. We'll gain lift, save fuel. We'll make it. The co-pilot frowned. He knew the maneuver. Dangerous, demanding perfect control, and nobody had ever tried it in a jet this size. "You ever done this before?" he asked skeptically. Matthew took a breath. "No, but I've studied those who have. I know how it works." For a moment he hesitated. He looked outside. The storm was closing in. His pulse raced. Sweat ran down his neck. In that instant, he wasn't the kid from the simulators. He was a real kid, scared of messing up. He knew if he failed, death would come for everyone, including his mother just rows away. For a heartbeat, he thought about quitting, just for that heartbeat. Then he remembered every time he'd been called a dreamer. Every night he'd studied by candlelight, every time he'd gone to bed hungry so he could buy a used aviation magazine. He thought of his mother's face when they first stepped onto the plane. Right there, amid the chaos, something inside him stiffened. If we try the open field, we all die. If we try the lake, maybe we live. I'd rather try. Silence. Leandro stepped forward slowly. No sarcasm, no authority, no ego, just one simple question. "And what do you need me to do?" Matthew met his gaze, unafraid. "Trust me." The sky darkened fast, as if time itself hurried to test the boy. The storm roared on the horizon. The plane, now skimming low, tore through the air with effort, shaking like a kite about to crash. Cabin lights flickered, the radio crackled, but the lake was in sight. Matthew fixed his eyes on the point where water met sky. He knew if he misjudged the angle, they'd hit the surface and the plane would break apart. But if he flew inches above, ground effect would give them the extra lift they needed, an invisible push. The co-pilot watched, no longer instructor, but passenger. Marinalva closed her eyes, mouthing a silent prayer. Fear stole her words. The plane dipped lower. The radar screamed. The wing sliced through the air like a dull blade. They passed over the lake. For a second, it felt like they were floating. The maneuver worked. Lift increased. Altitude steadied, and ahead the strip appeared. Small, uneven, but there. A straight line between sky and ground. But the challenge wasn't over. Landing gear wouldn't deploy. Neither would the flaps or brakes. It was like trying to stop a truck on a soap-covered hill. Matthew didn't hesitate. He made a choice only someone who'd studied failures and seen crashes would dare. A controlled spin, a kind of air drill. He'd used the plane's rotation to bleed off energy, tipping the fuselage sideways so it wouldn't flip. Nobody understood, but he knew what he was doing. "Hold on tight," he said, not yelling, just firm. The plane kissed the ground, no gear down, metal against earth. The roar was deafening. Matthew yanked the yoke. The plane spun, once, twice, 3 times, skidding like a wounded animal. Inches from a hangar, he slammed the emergency hydraulic brake. The plane stopped. Silence. Total. 2 seconds passed without a single breath. Then the screams, people crying, people laughing, people in shock, flight attendants hugging, children calling for their parents, all alive, all of them. Matthew fell backward. His body gave out. He fainted. Right there. Exhausted. Empty. As the fuselage cracked behind him, the boy who saved 147 lives was carried out in the arms of 2 firefighters. He never heard the applause, never saw his mother kneeling in tears, never saw Leandro silent, hand to heart. But in that moment, everyone knew that boy had saved an entire airplane. White light, the smell of ether. Voices in the background mixed with the distant sound of a TV. Matthew opened his eyes slowly. He was lying down, tubes beside him, a monitor beeping. His body felt light, almost floating. He didn't know if he was still on the plane. For a moment he thought he'd died, but then he saw his mother's face. Marinalva was crying quietly, seated on a plastic chair by the bed. Hollow eyes, calloused hands gripping a glass of water. "You're alive, my son." He tried to smile, but he was weak, very weak. The doctor came in shortly after, spoke calmly but directly. Mild anemia, signs of slight malnutrition, low blood pressure, nothing serious, nothing food, rest and care couldn't fix. Nothing, if he hadn't just saved 147 people on a crashing plane. Outside, the hospital was surrounded by reporters. The news was sweeping the nation. 13-year-old boy takes control of plane and prevents tragedy. Cabin images had leaked. Experts weighed in. Veteran pilots called it a miracle. Social media exploded with videos of his mother praying, the crew in tears, and a boy collapsing at the end of the runway, hailed as a hero. But Matthew wasn't watching any of it. He was thinking about only one thing. He was embarrassed. Embarrassed by his poorly cared-for teeth, his torn clothes, his stomach growling with hunger, a childhood spent invisible. And now, everyone was staring. That's when the door opened. Leandro Albuquerque entered. No bodyguards, no suit, no watch. Just him, a man broken inside and rebuilt by a landing that shouldn't have happened. He stopped at the bedside, his eyes red. It took him a moment to speak. "Happy birthday, Matthew." The boy's eyes widened. "Today?" Leandro nodded, pulled a small package from his pocket, a chocolate bar, one of the common kind. It was all he'd managed to buy on the way over, after leaving the hospital where he'd also been checked out. "I will never forget this date as long as I live." Silence. Then Leandro knelt. No ceremony, no script. "I judged you. I ignored you. And you saved me." He swallowed hard. "I want to apologize and tell you that my life changes today. From now on, I'm going to use everything I have to give wings to other Matthews, so no one else has to rely on luck." Matthew didn't answer. He just let a single tear fall. For the first time since it all began, he cried. Here, he wasn't the airplane hero. He was just a boy finally seen. The following days were a whirlwind. Tributes, news reports, calls from officials. Veteran pilots visited the hospital. One wept as he hugged Matthew, saying he'd never seen anything like it in 40 years of aviation. The landing video went viral. People across Brazil said the same thing. This boy deserves a future. And that future began right then. Matthew received a full scholarship to the country's top aviation school. He got a brand new uniform, all the gear, lessons in state-of-the-art simulators, with instructors now asking him for advice. But none of that changed him. He stayed shy, humble. When asked how he did it, he answered only, "It wasn't me. God guided me." Marinalva became a symbol of strength. She received help, security, medical support. No longer washing others' clothes, she now washed her own with pride, knowing the world finally recognized what she'd always seen in her son. Leandro Albuquerque changed too. He sold part of his company, cut his own salary, and founded a social project with a simple but powerful name, Wings of the Future. Its goal: reveal invisible talents in the outskirts, train, support, empower. Because he'd realized what many rich people still hadn't seen, Brazil is full of Matthews. People just need to look. The first class numbered 15 kids, almost all from forgotten neighborhoods, almost all written off, except for Matthew, who was now their role model, mentor, and friend. On the day of his first official student flight, Matthew put on his uniform, pulled on his new sneakers, and looked out through the terminal window. The sky was clear. Marinalva stood beside him, proud, hands over her heart. Leandro stood there too, in silence, eyes glistening. The instructor called. Matthew climbed the steps of the small plane, entered the cockpit, touched the controls, took a deep breath, then looked out the window and saw the same sky as before. But now, it belonged to him. Outside, Marinalva waved. The plane began to taxi. If this were a movie, the camera would pull back. But here, there was only a narration and a reverent silence. The final line came like a signature. Talent has no zip code, but it has hunger and courage. Now that you've seen what one boy was capable of, tell me, what if the next Matthew is you, or your child, or someone invisible in your neighborhood? If this story moved you, share it. Someone needs to hear this today.